Good morning, Habakkuk Christian Church. This is Pastor Trey, and we are in part 9 of our 12-part series on the minor prophets. And today is my very favorite, and has been for quite a while, my very favorite minor prophet, Habakkuk, right after Nahum, right before Zephaniah in your Bibles. So you want to grab your Bible. 3 chapters long. I'm going to get a little preachy. That's fine. I'm going to get preachy, but I'm going to get excited because there's some great messages. There's really one overall great message from Habakkuk. Now, ultimately, Habakkuk is he's talking about the Babylonians. Well, they would have come in. They were the ones that God used to discipline Judah, southern kingdom. The northern kingdom had already been fallen. They had already fallen to Assyria. And so we know that Nebuchadnezzar first came in. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, and he first came in like 605 BC. Eventually, they came in and thumped and took over and took everybody into captivity in 538. But as early as 605, about 70 years before that, Nebuchadnezzar started to threaten and started to bring some people from Jerusalem into Babylon. So we think that Habakkuk is probably right before this happened. He's prophesying. Now, not much is known about Habakkuk at all. He's probably the most obscure of all of the prophets. But like I said, this is my favorite one. Let me tell you a story, and I'll leave the names out to protect the innocent. In one of my ministries, a young man had come to me with a concern. He felt like God had moved far away from him. He couldn't feel God anymore. He'd been one of those guys it was very experiential. Would be able to feel God, was able to speak in tongues and things like that. Felt just very close, very intimate with God. He had gone to a Bible college or a Christian college and met a gal, and they started dating. And a couple years into their and they would pray together. They would worship together. They had a great relationship, and their relationship with God is very strong and very experiential. At one point, he was feeling like God was telling him to break up with this gal. There was nothing was bad about their relationship, but he just felt like God was saying, "Hey, I want you to step out in faith, and I want you to break up with her." And so he talked with her, and they decided, well, if that's what God is doing, let's just do this. And so they broke up. And he said immediately, God stopped talking to him. There was no longer that intimacy. There was no longer that experience that he had come to love and understand, and just it fed his faith to know that God was very, very real. And all of a sudden, God just stopped. And he said, it's been 3 years, Trey, since I have had any kind of that kind of experience with God, and I'm afraid maybe I've lost my salvation. I'm wondering about my faith in God. Was that all just a trick? Was it a lie? What's going on? Why am I feeling so spiritually empty? And at first I wanted to give him the good pastor answer, saying, well, have you been reading the Bible? And he goes, yes, I've been reading the Bible. And he goes, and I've been coming to church, and I've been praying. But he says, nothing is bringing back that experience. Well, it's very interesting that I had just read in my personal Bible study, I just read through the book of Habakkuk and was blown away. So many amazing things about this book. And all of a sudden I realized that what this kid, he was in his mid-20s, was going through, mid to late 20s, was exactly what Habakkuk was going through at the very beginning of his book. See, Habakkuk is a prophet, which meant that he receives messages from God. You got to be fairly intimate with God in order for you to get a message from God to deliver to the people. That's what a prophet does. And again, sometimes their prophecy is something far into the future. Sometimes it's something that is happening right then and there. And it's a message from God for his people that a prophet delivers. And so there is a connection that a prophet must have with God in order for them to have that ability to hear from God and have that message, right? So you open up to the book of Habakkuk in chapter 1, says, here's the prophecy. And immediately you hear Habakkuk saying, how long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? He says, why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There's strife and conflict abounds. And therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, and so that justice is perverted. Habakkuk was looking at the state of affairs in Judah and realizing that these guys were just blowing it. And he has been calling out to God for answers, that God would somehow bring back his people into a right relationship with him. He had been calling out. So I talked to this guy about this opening of Habakkuk. And I said, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? How long do you stay silent? And I told this guy, I said, we don't know. It could have been 3 years, just like it's been 3 years for him that God was silent and not answering him. So I began to think, why would God stay silent? Habakkuk's complaint was legitimate. The people of God had gone astray. They had turned to idols. They were oppressing each other. They were not acting as God's people. And Habakkuk said, God, when are you going to bring us back? And I need some answers from you. And God stays silent. Why? Why does God stay silent? I'm sure that you watching this video, you have had times where God feels distant. And you look at your life and maybe somebody says, well, God feels distant because you're in sin or you haven't been in the word or whatever. And you're thinking, well, sometimes yes, but sometimes no, I'm doing great. I'm following the rules. I'm being a godly person. And yet God just seems distant. Why would he do that? I began to contemplate that in my own life. There's been times where it just felt like God was so distant. And then that's when I realized that there's a verse in Hebrews that says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. And we're told that faith is the things, this confidence in the things that we don't see. So is it possible for us sometimes to get so comfortable with our relationship with God that we no longer really come to him in faith? We just kind of know, well, this is how he does things. This young man that I was talking to, he had come to realize that his experience with God was defined by these things. God would come down and give him this experience. He would feel these things. He would speak in tongues and all these kinds of different things. And so it's almost as if he had become very familiar with God. And it's said that familiarity breeds contempt, because if we think that we've got God figured out, because this is how he's always been, how he's always spoken to us, how he's always related to us, well, then pretty soon he becomes very predictable, and we can put him in a box and we can say, okay, God, I know that you've done this in the past, so therefore I'm expecting you to do this now. At that point, does God sometimes say, you don't really know me, do you? Yes, you know how I have operated up till now in your life, but does God have the right to change the way that he gives you an experience? Does God have the right to stay silent sometime just to see what you're going to do? Because he wants us to come to him in faith. And if all of a sudden your relationship with him becomes more about your experience than trusting him, then when he stops doing what you have trusted and starts to do something else, are you shaken? Will that shake your faith? Will you stop having faith and stop trusting him because he stopped doing things that you had gotten so accustomed to? How long, O Lord, will you stay silent? Habakkuk says. And God finally does answer. Um, and it's very interesting what he says, because his answer, if you read through the last part of chapter, or the middle part of chapter 1, he says, well, okay, well, look and be amazed. Watch the nations. He says, I'm raising up the Babylonians in verse 6, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. So obviously Nebuchadnezzar was already on world conquest at this point, and the Babylonians had already gotten a reputation that Judah would have known about, that they are a horrible people. And God says, yeah, okay, so you want me to do something about the injustice of my people? You want me to do something about the wickedness of my people? Okay, I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe. I'm going to raise up a people that are even more wicked, and I'm going to use them to discipline my people. He talks about how they're a feared and dreaded people. He talks about their way of conquest with swift horses. They fly like an eagle, swooping to devour. And they just go through and they mock kings, scoff at rulers, and fortified cities they're not going to hold up against them. And so God says, okay, you want an answer, Habakkuk? You want me to talk? Well, I'm going to tell you an answer that you aren't going to like. Now, have you ever been there in your life where you have prayed earnestly for an answer to a prayer, and God comes back with an answer that you just don't like, whether it's a no or a I'm going to work in this direction instead? How do you deal with that? How does that set with your faith? It's almost as if this is, yes, God is telling Habakkuk what he is getting ready to do with the Babylonian captivity. But it's almost as if this is a lesson for Habakkuk to say, how much do you trust me, Habakkuk? How much do you say you trust me, but how much do you really trust me? And so he then gives him this answer. He goes, okay, you want me to do something about the wickedness of my people? Okay, I'm going to bring in the Babylonians, a more wicked people. This is what Habakkuk then says. Lord Adonai, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. And so, yes, you have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. So you can see him trying to get his head around this and trying to be okay with it, saying, okay. But then it's almost as if he's saying, but I know you, God. Verse 13 says, your eyes are too pure to look upon evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. So it's almost as if he is questioning God's answer to him by saying, why do you tolerate the treacherous? Ultimately, he's saying, why are you going to use them? They're even worse than your people. And so if they come at us, it's like you've made people like the fish of the sea, verse 14, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. And so the wicked come and they pull all of them up with hooks. And then they don't rejoice in you who gave them that catch. They rejoice in their own nets, their own efforts. God, you're using this people that are not even going to give you glory. Why are you doing this? And so then chapter 2 begins. And again, the chapters are kind of they are a man-made invention to just help us identify where verses are and such. In English, when we are reading a book, a new chapter kind of represents a new theme. And sometimes that works in the Bible, sometimes it doesn't. I think chapter 2, the first verse, is actually kind of a culmination of the last part of chapter 1. So this is what Habakkuk says. He goes, I'm not sure I like your idea, God, about using a people that are more treacherous than your own people to thump us. He says, I will stand up my watch. I will station myself at the ramparts, and I'll look to see what you're going to say to me now, what answer you're going to give to me for this complaint. It's almost as if Habakkuk is now challenging God to say, defend your actions here, God. I don't get it. Now, have you ever not gotten God? He's done something in your life that you just think, why? I don't get it. It's like when Job, he stayed quiet. He kept defending himself, and finally he said, God, why? And God goes, oh, big boy on the block knows everything else and needs to know why I do everything. And for two chapters, it's an amazing part of Job where God questions Job about all these things that Job doesn't get. He'll never get. There are two things that we must understand about this life. There is a God, number one, and number two, we are not him. And if we can get our heads around him, then we are better than him. We're bigger than him. We can control him. And so here's Habakkuk. He's coming back at God, which, by the way, don't ever think that God is offended by when we come at him with some questions like this. I mean, at least we are questioning and we're going to the right place. It's like if you're at a restaurant and something is wrong, you want to see the manager because he can do something to fix it, right? If you're in a store, you want to see the person in charge. Well, it's not bad to go at God. God's not like, oh no, here comes Trey with all of his anger at me. Jacob, God allowed Jacob to wrestle with him. And then he got a new name called Israel, which means wrestles with God. And God chose to call his own people then Israel, wrestles with God, because in the wrestling, we learn something. In the wrestling, we get a better understanding. In wrestling, we exercise our muscles. I remember times when I was growing up that I'd wrestle my dad, and he had at least 60 pounds on me at that time, and invariably I would lose. But even if I lost, I felt invigorated because endorphins were released in my body, and my muscles had been exercised. And yeah, I had lost, but and I had wrestled with my dad, and I had lost, but I was invigorated, and I had learned something. Now, Jacob, when he wrestled with God, did come away with a limp that would be there for the rest of his life. So you got to be careful when you're wrestling with God. You're not going to come out unscathed. He wins, okay? He always wins. But he allows us to wrestle with him because in the wrestling, there's a lot of things to be learned. And so here's Habakkuk kind of feeling his oats, saying, okay, God, what are you going to answer me on this? What God says to him gives him a way different perspective. And I get emotional about this kind of stuff because God says, okay, listen, write this down. Now, why is he writing it down? Is because he says it's not going to happen right now. It's not going to happen right now, Habakkuk. You have to wait. In fact, you may have to wait and let other generations see what I'm getting ready to do, what I'm going to do eventually. You may not see it in your time. Now, are we ever okay when God does that for us? When he says to us, I'm going to answer you, but I'm not going to answer you in your time. What I'm doing with you, you won't ever get to see the results from. You'll actually have to, your grandkids will see the answers. And are we okay with that? Sometimes we're okay with waiting as long as we get to see it. But God says, write it down, put it on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time, and it speaks of the end, and it will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come. It won't delay. In my time, Habakkuk, this will happen. Yes, the enemy is puffed up. I get it. His desires are not upright. I get it. But the righteous will live by faith. This will be quoted in the New Testament by Paul, by the author of Hebrews. The righteous will live by their faith in me. Ultimately, what he's saying is those who trust me to the very, very end, they're going to understand. You go to the book of Revelation, and there's this scene in heaven where the souls of the martyred, those who've been killed for their faith, are like under the altar. And the altar would have represented where the incense was burned and the prayers going up to God. And they say, how long, O Lord, will it be before you avenge our deaths? They're looking for justice. They're looking for righteousness. And ultimately God says, hey, I will do this in my time. I will do it in my time, and it will be fine. You just need to wait for me. The righteous will live by faith. That means I'm not always going to do what they want me to do. I'm not always going to act in the way that they want me to act, but I have things in control. And if they will just watch me and wait, things are going to happen in my time, in my control, and they will live. They will live when they trust me. Then he goes on to say, you know what, one day you'll taunt your enemies. This is actually seems very much like what Isaiah said when he said that the king of Babylon will fall, and you'll take up this taunt against him and say, oh man, you thought you could be better than God, and yet you have fallen, and look at you. The worms are eating you. You are a man. You're not this God. You are just a mere mortal, and God has brought you and laid you low. That's eventually what happens with the king of Babylon, and Babylon does eventually fall to the Medes and the Persians, and that happens all during Daniel's time. And God then uses the king of Persia, Cyrus, to let his people leave Babylon, and not very many people do, but about and they come back in waves. But they do get to go back to their homeland from an issue from the king that deposes Babylon. And so there is this taunt as people are going back to Israel saying, ha, you thought you had won Babylon, but you didn't. And God remembered his people. And so that's ultimately what the chapter 2 is all about. Woe to him who piles up stolen goods. Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Ultimately, they're saying, you know what, the piper needs to be paid eventually, Babylon. You think you're the big boy on the block. Eventually, you're going to get what's coming to you. And so this is a promise that God has given to Habakkuk that eventually, sorry, my dog is drinking from the bowl, and it's making the clang with his collar. Sorry. Anyways, God says, eventually you will win. I will win. I will destroy the enemies, and you just have to wait, and eventually you will be vindicated. That's what all of this is all about. He says these guys, they trust in idols. That's kind of in the last part of chapter 2 chapter 2, verse 18. Of what value is their idols crafted by craftsmen? And one of the things it says, he makes idols that cannot speak. Throughout the Bible, you see these little jabs that God has on the false idols, these false gods that are made out of wood or whatnot. And he says they don't speak. God seems to pride himself as being a God who does speak. And so even though he was silent for however long, now he is speaking. And when he speaks, his words are true, and we need to just have faith in them. And that's ultimately what Habakkuk is learning. Finally, chapter 3, Habakkuk comes to his senses. And he says, listen, I've heard of your fame, Lord, and I stand in awe of your deeds. Folks, when God speaks, when God reveals his plans, though they are not what we want, when he says, just trust me, what he wants from us is a sense of worship, a sense of, you know what? There is a God, you are him. And I resign from being in charge of the universe. I resign from being in charge of my life. Things are going to happen in my life that I would not have wanted. But that doesn't mean that there is no God. That actually does mean that there is a God who is way higher than me. And I just need to stand in awe and worship. That's what God wants of me. He wants my worship. He doesn't want me to try to figure him out. He wants my worship. There needs to be some things that are so powerful, so much more awesome than what I could ever figure out in my brain about my God. And when I encounter those things, that should not draw me away from him. That should draw me closer to worship in a God that is just so much higher than what I can even understand. And so that's ultimately what chapter 3 is all about. But here is my favorite. He said, listen, okay, so be it, God. You're going to bring the Babylonians in. We're going to have to endure for a time. This is what you've said. He said, though, verse 17 of chapter 3, this is one of my favorite passages in all of Scripture. He says, though the fig tree does not bud, though there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, though there are no cattle in the stalls. What he is describing are all these things that people would say, well, if God's blessing you, all these things are going to happen. It's kind of like some television preachers will say to you, well, if you're pleasing God, he's going to give you a lot of great things. He wants you to be healthy and wealthy and live a long life. And I say, well, except for what about those dear saints who have this intimate relationship with God and God has them suffering? And they're living in poverty and they lose things and they're not healthy and they're not wealthy. What happens then? That's a lie, folks. That's a lie that God only wants to bring these things into our life. Yes, when you see those things, when the fig tree is blossoming and the grapes are there and you have the olive crop and the fields are producing and you've got flocks, that is God's blessing, by the way. Abraham had flocks and herds and cattle and all of that kind of stuff. That was God's blessing. God chose to bless Abraham in that way. And Abraham, I mean, that was not a bad thing at all. There are people that God does bless like this. But when this is the standard, and this has to be there in place for you to actually trust God, that you have to see all of these things that our culture would say is blessing. If that's your standard for a belief in God, you have missed the boat entirely. Because sometimes God does that, and sometimes God does not. And if your faith is based on what you're going to get from God only, then your faith is not faith. The righteous will live by faith, God tells Habakkuk. And so, though all of these things do not happen, Habakkuk, this is his conclusion. Though I don't see anything that my culture would say is a blessing from you, God. Verse 18, yet, even though all of these things, they're not there, yet I will rejoice in Yahweh, in Jehovah God, in Adonai, the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. See, there's this trust that even though there's not all of these things, God is still going to win. He's still going to save. He says, the sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. An amazing book out there by Hannah Hurnard called Hind's Feet on High Places. He makes my feet like hind's feet. A hind would be a deer that would be able to, like a gazelle, just jump up on the mountaintops. He makes my feet like hind's feet and enables me to tread on the heights, hind's feet on high places. That's ultimately where Habakkuk's faith lies, is that even though it's going to be difficult, to climb a mountain is difficult, folks. I don't know if you've ever tried it, rock climbing, mountain climbing. I've in my youth, when I was much lighter, less heavy, I tried my hand at rock climbing. It's amazing, but it's amazingly hard. And yet to be able to jump onto the high places like a deer would be able to. Habakkuk is trusting God to give him that strength. That doesn't mean that the mountain is going to be made low, and so we don't have to climb the high places. It means that we will be able to do that because we've trusted God through all of the times where he's sometimes even silent. And then when he answers and it's not the right answer, the sovereign Lord, that means that he's in charge 100%. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and enables me to tread on the heights. And this was then a director of music. This was a song Chapter 3 was a song that was supposed to be sung on stringed instruments. So, anyways, guys, that's my encouragement to you. I love the book of Habakkuk. Stay in that. Keep reading that. He starts out in the darkness. He ends up with this amazing song of faith in God. Love you guys. We're getting very, very close. Be watching for a message from me. We had our board meeting last night, and I got some news about reopening the church in phases, just like the state. I know, frustrating, and yet we need to do it wisely and without making a lot of mess. So, love you. We'll see you very, very soon. Talk to you later. Bye.